Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to share with you the 7 best PvE Arc tames. Also, before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe as it helps the channel. In at number 7 is the Pteranodon. Now this is really an essential beginner tame to any PvE player, as its saddle is unlocked as early as level 38, which means you can get into the air without having to go further into the game. Something like an RG is far superior, but its saddle was unlocked in the late 60s, and that is going to take a while, especially if you're using official settings. So the Pteranodon really is very much a viable solution for getting you in the air really early on. And really what a good feeling this is. The first time you get up into the air in Arc, it is literally heaven. And on top of all of that, it does make metal farming and just general resource harvesting so much easier, as you don't have all of the risks of all of the creatures on the ground. If there is a Giga looming below you, you don't have to worry, you can just simply fly past it. Unless you run out of stamina, of course, because then that's not going to go well for you. And that is actually one of the things which the Pteranodon does definitely struggle with. And also, its saddle is a little bit expensive for level 38. Getting that chitin and keratin can actually be a real pain. But either way, back to its stamina and also its weight. Sadly, they are not that great. If you do tame a high enough level, you should be fine, but still, these things compared to something like an RG are definitely lacking in this department. Obviously, you can level it up to make it a bit better, but especially an unleveled one or a low leveled one, which you probably will have considering you are quite early into the game. These things are an absolute pain sometimes for metal runs, as your character's taking up about 200 in the weight department, and it only has 300 weight, so like that, it is instantly full. So, in at number 6 is the Daedon. Now these things only really have one use for me, which is actually healing creatures, as these things do have a special healing ability. But just remember, this thing does take a hell of a lot of meat, and also you will need to level up a lot of food into this thing, as it is going to absolutely tank when this ability is being used. Also, on top of that, these things are quite an easy tame thanks to that ability as well, as these things will tank through food while taming, so these are a very quick tame. But once you have got one of these things tamed, how are you actually going to use that ability that I've talked about? When you hold down the ride button when you're near your creature, which on PC is E, you'll have access to a scroll wheel menu where you can enable passive healing. Once this is activated, this will heal any of your tamed creatures and is an insanely useful feature if you are trying to fight bosses. Definitely get a Daedon. In at number 5 is the Yeti. Now this does have a very similar use to the Daedon, as this is really a creature for fighting bosses. That is because of its 2 raw abilities. This thing has a fear roar, which will debuff the enemy creature, and it also does have a courage roar, which will buff your creatures and also debuff the enemy. But also, on top of all of that, it is a very solid carnivore as well. It has a reasonable amount of health. It's not quite as much as the Rex, but it is still a very reasonable amount. And also, on top of that, it does have quite a reasonable amount of melee damage. This thing will definitely pack a punch if you do ram it into a couple of mammoths or whatever creatures you are trying to kill. These things are also great in a PvP scenario as well, due to their fear roar. As if someone's trying to raid your base on a Pteranodon, these things can simply fear roar, and then the player has completely lost control of their Pteranodon. You may have also experienced this as well if you were trying to raid someone's base with a Pteranodon, or if you're just casually roaming through the ice biome and the Yeti lets out its fear roar. This is definitely a feature which you can put to use, which will really annoy other players and also keep you safe at the same time. Definitely at some point tame yourself a Yeti. And in at number 4 is the RG. Now this thing really is the king of harvesting. This thing is far superior than the Pteranodon for pretty much anything apart from speed. This thing is able to harvest metal with absolute ease, and it does also have weight reduction on metal, crystal, obsidian, and even more objects similar to that. This thing is absolutely amazing when paired with an Anki, as the Anki will automatically harvest metal when picked up by the RG when it is hovered over a metal node, and it is just so convenient and so quick. But the thing is, once the Anki has reached 70% of its weight, you will need to do this manually, but it doesn't really matter because this thing is going to be getting a lot of metal anyway, as Ankis do have a really good weight stat. Also, on top of that, it does have a couple of special abilities as well. Namely, its ability that when it eats a dead body, this thing is going to heal so quickly. Which means if you have just gotten yourself out of a fight, just kill something very simple like a dodo or a dilo, and this thing is going to heal up super quick. And also, on top of all of that, its saddle acts as a portable smithy. How amazing. In at number 3 is the Mantis. Now this, to be honest, is really one of my favourite Ark harvesters. This thing is really a great creature, and it can definitely be put to use in PvE. Yes, this thing does not spawn on the island, but it does spawn on Raasclark, and Raasclark is still a free map, so this thing is not behind a paywall. And in fact, none of the creatures on this list are behind a paywall, except obviously Ark itself. The Mantis really does have a special ability which no other creature has. It has the ability to wield any type of melee weapon. Swords, pikes, picks, hatchets, you name it, this thing can equip it. In this case here, I am showing you it with swords, as this is what I use for harvesting mutton on Raasclark. This thing really is a very fun way to harvest mutton, as I often find myself actually bored of harvesting, but as soon as I whip this thing out, it makes it so much more fun and things actually get done. Also, on top of that, it is a viable way for getting metal as well, as it can equip pickaxes. And if you didn't know, pickaxes are the way to actually harvest metal from a metal node. The only thing it's really lacking in that department is weight, and it does not have weight reduction for things like metal, crystal, and obsidian. Also, be careful, as it does have a pretty low health stat. In at number 2 is the Thyla. Now this thing really is absolutely legendary. This is definitely the #1 travel mount in Ark. Absolutely no questions asked. This thing is really insane when it comes to mobility. It does have a lot of speed and also a lot of abilities, which mean any piece of Ark terrain is an absolute breeze to get through. Unless it's an enemy base, as these things aren't the best turret soakers, but in a PvE situation you're not going to be doing that anyway, so these things are pretty much good for everything. You can even take them caving if you want as well, except sometimes they are a bit too big. Also, the Thyla does have a very decent amount of melee damage, and also on top of that, it does have a special ability with its attack as well. When it attacks a creature, it has a bleed ability, which means this thing can do absolutely insane damage to any creature it hits. A Giga is actually very easy to kill with a high level one of these, which you wouldn't expect, but if you have played Ark for a while and you've used one of these things, you know what an absolute powerhouse they are. But the abilities don't even stop there. It has another ability as well, apart from climbing walls, having a bleed ability, and just being absolutely insane. These things also have a pounce ability. Truly a great creature. And finally, in at number 1 is the Baryonyx. Now this thing really is the king of PvE Ark for me, as this thing is just so useful in so many different ways. Firstly, I'm going to talk about its speed and mobility. This thing is great for getting around, and also it doesn't get stuck on everything in Ark like a Giga or Rex would. These things also do have great melee damage as well, and you certainly shouldn't underestimate these things. These can actually take out Gigas if you do have a high enough level. Maybe don't take them as far as bosses, but these things are still pretty much great for everything else. Also, on top of that, these things are the best creatures by far for doing any kind of cave runs. These things will pretty much fit into any cave you can find, and they will deal great amount of damage in that time, and they will get through every obstacle that you will face. Also, on top of all of that, they have a wealth of abilities to go with it as well. The spin ability, which you might have just seen there, is only accessible in water and is activated by pressing C on the keyboard. This thing is really a great ability for doing the underwater caves on an island, as it is actually a stunning ability. And as you will see in a second, this thing can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon. This won't work with Plesios or Mosas, but still, most of the underwater creatures you will encounter, you can instantly stun just by pressing a button. But as every good creature, these things do sadly have a downside. These things don't have a lot of health, and they spawn in the swamp. Not great. Hello and welcome. In today's top 7, I'm going to share with you the best easy Ark tames. And just before we get into it, like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel. So in at number 7 is the Yeti. The Yeti is definitely an essential Ark tame for boss fights, and is also just a great carnivore overall. This thing is relatively simple to tame, but the only real difficulty is this is usually found in very hostile areas of the map. And usually with a Yeti you will always find a couple of Carnotauruses, as they always like to follow the Yutis, as the Yeti commands the Carnos to follow it and attack for it. But overall, it is just a very simple knockout tame, so it actually isn't too bad. If you are well prepared and you do have yourself the net launcher or a trap, this thing will be a very easy tame. But once you've tamed it, what are you actually going to use it for? Like I said before, this thing does have amazing melee damage, but it also has two special abilities. Firstly, it has the Fear Roar, which will debuff the enemy creature, and also it does have a Courage Roar as well, which will buff your creatures and also debuff the enemy creatures. But just take into mind that the Fear Roar's effects will only work on creatures of a certain size. So look for medium to smaller size creatures. Anything really up to the size of a Argy or a Pteranodon should be fine for the Fear Roar to work. In at number 6 is the Aloe. Now this thing is really a great carnivore which pretty much every Ark player should tame, and it is only a little bit easier to actually tame than the Yeti because it tends to not have as many hostile creatures around it, but this is still a very simple knockout tame that doesn't really require too much prep to be able to tame this thing successfully. Just either bring a next gun or a trap and quite a few tranks. The Allosaurus, when wild, will usually spawn in packs of 3, and in that pack there will be a pack alpha. If you didn't know already, the pack alpha is determined by the level of the actual creature, so the highest level allo in the pack will become the alpha. Now in my opinion, you should just build a trap to tame this thing, and then you can lure all 3 of the Allosauruses into the trap, and you can tame 3 in one go, giving yourself a nice little pack of Allosauruses just to get you started. And also their saddle isn't unlocked at a very high level as well, so you can definitely tame it in the mid game and fully utilize these things. Also, on top of that, once tamed, these things have a wealth of great abilities, and you can also take advantage of that pack buff which you see in the wild once tamed as well. The pack creature will have an orange glow, and it is essentially just a buffed Allosaurus. It will just be able to deal more damage and have a damage resistance buff. And if you count mate boost as well, your Allosauruses are going to be buffed even more. And also on top of that, they do have the bleed ability when they attack something, which will instantly drain the health of that creature. And I think it's about 25% of a creature's health with one bleed damage drain, which to be honest is really insane. And no matter the health of that creature, it will still deal that 25%. So it is a way to really easily kill really tough dinosaurs. And this is an ability that even the Rex doesn't have, so it actually does have an advantage over some bigger carnivores. Speaking of the Rex, in at number 5 is the Rex. Now this thing is definitely a great carnivore for boss fights, not because it deals the most damage or has the most health out of any Ark creature. It's mainly because it is just so balanced in every way. Yes, it does have a great health stat and a great melee stat, but compared to something like a Spino, it is a lot more balanced. Yes, a Spino may do a bit more melee damage than a Rex, but it has far less health, making it a lot less useful. But the thing is, compared to something like the Allo or the Uti, the Rex is actually usually a easier tame, as there is not as many hostile creatures around it. Allos usually come in packs, and Utis usually have Carnotauruses around them, whereas Rexes tend to travel alone. The only creatures that you actually find around them is just the general creatures that spawn in the area. You never really tend to find Rexes in packs, which actually makes it easier to tame overall, as you don't have to worry about even more hostile creatures. Then once you do actually have yourself a Rex tamed, this thing is going to be an absolute machine for any of your tasks. The only thing which I'm not really fond of with the Rex is it does tend to get stuck on a lot of the objects in the Ark world. But apart from that, you really can't complain, and it is definitely something special to have an Ark Rex. But keep in mind that its saddle is unlocked in the late 70s, as compared to an Allo, it may not be as accessible early on. In at number 4 is the Spino. Yet again, another carnivore that is easier to tame than the one before it. I assure you the next creature isn't one of these bigger Ark carnivores. Now personally, the reason why I think this is a lot easier to tame than something like the Rex is mainly because it spawns in a much less hostile environment. Yes, the rivers may have piranhas, but the mountains have RGs, other Rexes, scorpions, and sometimes even Gigas or the Carcharodontosaurus. So actually, the Spino spawning environment is usually a less hostile place. Also on top of that, I don't think it has as much torpor, so I'm pretty sure it takes less tranks to knock out than something like a Rex. And also it does have less health, so if you do have a reasonable melee weapon or creature, these things are a bit easier to kill if the tame goes completely wrong. And once you have tamed yourself a Spino, you do have yourself a real beast of a creature. It is definitely great to have a Spino, and I usually do definitely have one around. Like the Rex though, these things do tend to get stuck on quite a lot of objects in the Ark world. But compared to something like the Rex, they do have some abilities. Mainly, they have a hydration buff, which is also what the Shadowmane has as well. So when they touch water, they will actually get a damage buff and a damage resistance buff. Meaning these things are actual real beasts when in the water. And also, since the TLC update, these things can stand on their hind legs and do even more damage than otherwise. So these things are real beasts of the carnivore world, and they have a wealth of abilities on top of that. Definitely at some point tame yourself a Spino. So in at number 3 is the Daedon. Yet another great creature for bosses, and finally not a big carnivore tame. Because yes, carnivores aren't actually the only creatures you need to tame on Ark, even though all of the creatures on this list are carnivores. But either way, the Daedon is actually a very simple tame, and a Daedon will get you very far in boss progressions, and is also just a great creature if you have just been in a big fight with something like a Giga and your creatures are wounded, as this thing is going to heal your creatures very fast. Yes, not as fast as a Snow Owl, but on my top 10s, or in this case a top 7, I tend to put creatures that are not behind a paywall except Ark itself, so that is why the Daedon is on this list and not the Snow Owl. The Daedon is actually a very simple knockout tame and will tame very quickly, as this thing definitely likes to gobble meat, and if you are using that passive healing ability, you will know how much meat it takes. So in at number 2 is the RG. Now when I was preparing this video, I actually was dictating putting the Pteranodon on this list instead of the RG, but this is mid-game tames, and to be honest, an RG is just far superior than Pteranodon. It simply has to be on this list. Overall, this thing is a very simple knockout tame, only really requiring a trap if it is a high level. But for lower levels, this thing, you can just whack a few trank arrows into this thing and then follow it and maybe give it a couple more, and this thing will be out cold. Then after that, just feed it whatever meat you've got. Normal meat, prime meat, mutton, just whatever you have at the time, unless you're specifically taming a max level, and then you probably want to use kibble. But once you do have this thing tamed, you know how much of a beast an RG is. This thing is the best creature. I even rate it higher than the Quetzal for doing metal runs, as it has weight reduction on things like metal, obsidian and crystal. And on top of that, its saddle acts as a portable smithy. So this thing is insane, and if your metal tools break, you can just craft another one right on the fly. Unless you don't have smelted ingots, then you will have to go home for that. But the RG is really a mid-game creature worth taming. And in at number 1 is the Baryonyx. Now this thing really is the beast of any PvE Ark run, but also the beast of any mid-game Ark player's life. This thing is an absolutely insane creature, and every Ark player does need to tame one of these things at some point, because these are by far one of the most useful creatures you will ever tame in Ark. And on top of that, because this is an easiest tame list, these things aren't actually that difficult to tame, apart from you obviously having to go to the swamp, which is a rubbish biome, and every Ark player hates that. Never go to the swamp unless you're taming one of these things. These things are actually a very simple knockout tame, not really requiring a lot of skill or preparation. But just take into mind that these things do eat fish. Don't try and eat the meat and then get your tame killed by a Sarco because you left it overnight. I've made that mistake before. Don't make that mistake at all. But once you do have one of these things tamed, these are by far one of the best creatures for doing cave runs. These things will fit into pretty much any cave. Yes, this doesn't matter as much now with the introduction of cryopods, but these things are still very useful now, as they deal a very reasonable amount of melee damage, and they have enough health to carry you through any cave. And if you are doing underwater caves, they have a hidden secret ability. By pressing C on your keyboard, if you're on PC, they will have a spin ability, which will actually stun creatures up to the size of a megalodon. And for the underwater caves on the island, this thing is really great for that due to this ability. Maybe don't use it on Moses and plesiosaurs, as it doesn't work, but for anything smaller than a megalodon, this thing is insane. Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 best Ark cave tames. And before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel. In at number 5 is the Megalosaurus. Now this really is an insane caving creature, as long as you have a cryopod, as this thing isn't going to fit into every cave entrance. This thing also does actually spawn in caves as well, so it does really make sense why it is a great caving creature. But also, don't use this thing in the daytime, as it is going to be an absolute pain. But as soon as it turns night, this thing is an absolute walking menace. It has an insane amount of melee damage and a reasonable health stat to go along with it. Just maybe don't fight Microraptors with it, as that isn't going to end well. But as you can see here, it is actually utilizing one of its abilities. It will grab creatures in its mouth and absolutely demolish them, and they have no way of attacking back. And this is truly a great ability for just getting rid of all of those tiny creatures that are just really annoying you, like Microraptors, and in this case, definitely Microraptors. But this thing is also great at killing many other creatures as well. This thing has a very reasonable amount of melee damage and will basically kill anything that it attacks. A Baryonyx, very easy. A Spino, also very easy. And you could even do something like a Giga or a Carcharodontosaurus. And if you're really going for it, maybe a Titanosaur. Also, another feature that they have which makes them really great for caving is they are actually very mobile and they are reasonably small. Obviously not as small as a Baryonyx is, but they will still fit into most caves, and if you have cryopods, these things will be fine in any cave. These are a definite caving creature if you can shell out for the mild difficulty in taming one. At number 4 is the Mantis. Now personally, I think this is actually a great creature for caves. Obviously not underwater caves, and I probably wouldn't bring it into caves with lava as well, but this thing is still great for most of Ark's caves. Namely, it is quite a small creature. This thing will fit into pretty much any cave, and if you do have a cryopod, all of those little tight gaps, this thing should be able to get through, as you can just cryo it up, walk through yourself, and then cryo it outside of that gap. But the main reason why these things are actually good for caving, especially in quicker caves, is their ability that they can equip melee weapons. So you can have some pikes on your Mantis, or in this case, swords, and you can just plow through loads and loads of insects. You will just have to be wary about their health stat though, as sometimes that can be a bit iffy, and you really don't want to get your Mantis killed, as these things are a little bit of a pain to tame, as they require a ghillie suit, bug repellent, and either deathworm horns or woolly rhino horns. And it can take quite a lot of them if you are taming a high level, and if you're doing caves, you probably are going to want to tame yourself a high level, as you don't want this thing to absolutely suck in a cave. But if you do tame a Mantis of reasonable level, these things will be great for any cave runs you have. Just remember, like I've said many times, to really keep an eye on that health. At number 3 is the Megatherium. Now, if you didn't know about the Megatherium special ability, then you will not know how good of an insect killer this thing has. And actually, one of the main enemies that you will face in any kind of caves are insects, so it really does make sense why this thing deserves to be on this list. This thing is absolutely insane for killing insects, and it is the best creature by far for that. And especially in the caves with just so many insect enemies, having one of these things on your side is great. But there are some disadvantages to these things, namely they are quite big, so they're not really going to fit into smaller caves, and you're going to have to utilize cryopods, and then you'll probably have to wait for some cryosickness timers, as any tight squeeze in a cave this thing probably isn't going to fit through. But in some of Ark's bigger caves, this thing will definitely be great for the job, and it will be great for the job in any of these smaller caves as well, unless it's that one ice cave where you have to crouch the whole time. This thing is not going to fit, don't even try that. And pretty much for that cave, no creature's going to fit at all. But for those caves of reasonable size, with loads and loads and loads of insects in it, these things are a great shout, as they will plow through them with ease. And you can also utilize other creatures in the cave as well, but have this as a backup. In at number 2 is the Thyla. Now this thing actually is a really great cave creature. Yes, you may want to take something like a Sabertooth in, but I find they don't really do enough damage and they don't have enough health to rack up in most cave situations. And the Thyla definitely does deal enough damage and has enough health and agility to get the job done. The Thyla is equipped with a wealth of abilities, namely its bleed ability when it attacks. This is insanely useful when attacking any kind of creature. Yes, it does not have a buff, which is insane at attacking insects, but this thing can still really pack a punch. Overall, this thing is a very good creature for caving and better than the Megatherium, mainly because it is a lot smaller, and for caving, the size of the creature is probably one of the main factors. Obviously, health is going to be very important and damage as well, as you do need your creature to actually fight through the enemies and you need it to survive, but size is really something you need to consider, and the Thyla is a reasonable size for caving. It may not fit into every cave entrance, but with cryopods, this thing will be fine in almost every cave. But don't take this thing to underwater caves, as it is just going to drown. They are actually okay at swimming, so if the cave you're trying to run has a few underwater sections, these things will be fine, but don't take them into the underwater caves. And in at number 1 is the Baryonyx. Now these things are definitely a favourite of mine, and I personally think every Ark player should tame one of these things, especially if you are doing caving, as that is one of the main reasons to tame this thing. This thing is by far the beast of doing any cave run. Firstly, this thing has a very reasonable melee stat, and it will get you through any cave enemy that you can find. Unless you're going through hordes of insects, the Megatherium is still going to be the best at that. But also, on top of that, it does have a reasonable health stat as well. This thing is going to survive through any cave run that you go through. And these things have a horde of special abilities on top of that. Now, if you didn't know already, the Baryonyx has a secret ability underwater. When the Baryonyx goes underwater and you press C on your keyboard, it will have a spinning ability. This thing works as an attack. It's not going to do any damage, but it is going to stun any creature up to the size of a Megalodon. So this actually makes the Baryonyx a very viable creature for doing the underwater caves. Yes, a Basilow would be a great shout as well, but if you're on a bit of a budget, I might say, the Baryonyx is a great shout for doing those underwater caves as well. Also, on top of that, this thing's size is absolutely perfect. This thing fits into almost any cave, apart from that one cave where literally no creature can fit in, and that makes this thing so much more useful, as you do not have to wait for cryo timers, and in most cases you don't even need to use cryopods, so if you do not have access to them yet, the Baryonyx is a great shout. Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 best combat dinos for Ark Survival Evolved. And just before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel. In at number 5 is the Spino. Now, in my opinion, the Spino is an absolutely amazing combat creature, mainly due to how much damage it does and how many abilities it has to assist with its damage. Firstly, it has the hydration buff, which the Shadow main has as well, which enables it to do insane damage when in or touching water. Also, on top of that, it can stand up on its hind legs and do even more damage. A high level Spino with all of these abilities is actually going to do more damage than a Rex, but it does lack compared to the Rex in one major field. It has a lot less health than the Rex. Now, don't get me wrong, the Spino still has a reasonable health stat. It will still get you through most things quite easily, and quite a few bosses easily. But for the larger threats on Ark and those longer bosses, this thing's health just simply can't keep up with something like a Rex. Yes, 20k health is still great for any Arc creature, but compared to when you're getting your Rexes up to 50k health, it's not even half of the health of what a good leveled Rex can have. And for some of those longer bosses, especially the Master Controller on Genesis Part 2, it simply does not stack up in any way to the Rex. But all of this doesn't mean the Spino is a terrible combat creature, and obviously it isn't, because it wouldn't be on the list otherwise. This thing is still very useful and is actually a lot easier to tame than the Rex usually, because it spawns in less hostile environments, as there are less dangerous creatures around where a Spino is, because it's usually killed everything else, or it spawns in quite desolate areas. And speaking of the Rex, in at number 4 is the Rex. Now overall, the Rex is a lot better than the Spino for combat, mainly due to its much higher health stat. Whereas Spino has 20k, this thing can level up to something like 50k if you go breeding madness on these things. Just maybe don't take these things swimming. The Spino definitely does have a big advantage there. And also in terms of mobility, the Spino does have a big advantage as well. But today we're not talking about mobility, we're talking about sheer skill in combat. And this is a great creature for doing anything like that. This thing is great for doing any bosses if there aren't significant other creatures that will do better. For example, on the Broodmother, a Megatherium is going to do a lot better than a Rex because of that insect buff. But for something like the Dragon, you should never use the Rex because it has a buff against carnivores. But for pretty much every boss that isn't underwater, I'm talking about the Moda there, this thing will do great for every single Arc boss. And it really does show, because most Arc players will use Rexes, a Uti and a Daedon for pretty much every boss that they do. And also, on top of all of that, the Rex is just generally a fun creature to have. You can't say it isn't cool to ride around on a really high level Rex and just absolutely decimate every creature in the area. These things are great. In at number 3 is the Megatherium. Now briefly, we did talk about this when I talked about the Rex, and I mentioned that this thing is great for defeating the Broodmother. It is also a great caving creature, and it is great for killing any kind of insect. And the reason why this is because it has a special buff. Don't get confused with this buff and the alpha buff as well, as they look very similar. Once the Megatherium has killed a bug, it will have an ominous orange glow, and then it will just go into all fury. And I'm pretty sure it is called the Insect Rage buff or something similar to that. Also, on top of that, it is reasonably mobile and it has a decent health stat. But like every Arc combat herbivore, this thing does have a major downside, and that is the fact that herbivores can't actually heal very quickly. But in a boss situation with the Daedon, this shouldn't be much of an issue. But when you're just going out to kill some creatures to gather some chitin, you're not realistically going to bring a Daedon with you everywhere. So you'll have to use sweet vegetable cakes. And let me tell you, sweet vegetable cakes are actually very expensive, and a hell of a lot more expensive than meat. So be careful when you're going into long battles with this thing, as it will take quite a while to heal. So remember to really level some health when you get yourself a Megatherium. In at number 2 is the Giga. Now you probably expected this thing to be on the list, and you would definitely be right. This thing is an absolutely insane combat creature, but not a great boss creature, because this thing actually isn't allowed into most boss arenas, as it is considered too powerful. But on Extinction, all of the Titans use Gigas or Titans, or the next creature that is on this list. Either way, the Giga is an absolute hunk of a creature. It deals an immense amount of damage and has a hell of a lot of health. The Rex absolutely pales in comparison to the Giga. This thing can absolutely demolish through any creature that you will see in Ark. And if this thing was allowed into more boss arenas, I'm sure it would be very useful then. But the Giga has two main downsides. The first one that I want to talk about is its absolutely abysmal stamina. This thing's stamina is absolutely awful. It is going to run out of stamina so quickly. You can barely get this thing around without just a little thing popping up to say you've run out of stamina. And no matter how many levels you put into stamina, it's simply not going to improve for you, which is really sad. And the other downside is it has a rage meter. So once it has been dealt enough damage from whatever you were trying to fight, it will kick you off and simply go into a rage, killing you and also probably killing the creature you were trying to attack, considering it's not a boss. And in at number 1 is the Carcharodontosaurus. Now, in my opinion, this thing absolutely replaces the Giga in every way. This is by far the most insane, most powerful, most useful combat creature in my opinion. Except it still can't be let into most boss arenas, so you're still going to have to resort to a Rex or a Megatherium or whatever is more useful for those cases. But the reason why the Carcharodontosaurus is so much better than the Giga is it does everything the Giga does, but it does it a little bit better and it fixes all of the issues I had with the Giga. Firstly, this thing's stamina doesn't actually suck. It's not great at the beginning, but leveling it does actually make a difference. I wouldn't recommend putting all of your levels into it, as this is a combat creature and not a travel creature, but its stamina is still very reasonable. Also, on top of that, it doesn't have a rage meter as well, so it's not going to kick you off and absolutely demolish you. This thing also does have a blood rage, which means once it has killed enough creatures, it is going to do an insanely buffed amount of damage. And once it has actually reached this blood rage high, it's going to be dealing even more damage than the Giga. But like every great creature, it still does have a downside, and that is its taming method is a bit buggy at times, and it can really go wrong. Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 best travel mounts for Ark. And before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help out the channel. In at number 5 is the Baryonyx. Now you may think this actually isn't a great traveling creature, but trust me, this thing really is good at traveling. And its size means that it's not going to get stuck on literally everything that you see in Ark. And also on top of that, it has enough melee damage and enough health to keep off any of the enemies that you may face while you are traveling from base to base. But also on top of that, this thing is actually very quick and is also a very good swimmer, which means it can pretty much traverse through any landscape. Except don't take it up cliffs or walls, because it simply can't do that. You would need something like a Thyla, a Rock Drake, etc, etc. But the Baryonyx is still really good for all of those non-hilly areas of the Ark map. And like I said, this thing is great at swimming, but it does have an ability in water as well, which means it can really fend off in the deep sea. Except you are probably going to need some scuba equipment for that, so you don't drown. Also, you can have the Baryonyx quite early on in your Ark adventure, as this thing really isn't that difficult to tame at all, and its saddle isn't unlocked at an obscenely high level. So you do have convenient travel earlier on in your Ark stages. Yes, it's not going to pack the punch like a Rex, but it sure does travel a lot better than one of those, as its stamina is not abysmal and it doesn't get stuck on literally everything. And also, if you're in a PvP situation, a Baryonyx is more low profile. You are more hidden when on a Baryonyx than on something like a Rex, a Giga or a Carcharodontosaurus, so it's a good PvP travel mount as well. In at number 4 is the Megalosaurus. Now I would only really use this thing for travel on a map like Arboration, as this thing has so much use there, and enough people do play Arboration that I think this creature warrants being on the list for the 5 best travel mounts in Ark, as Arboration is a fan favourite of many players, so I think it does definitely deserve to get talked about. The Megalosaurus is a great creature which can really pack a punch in the fighting department, so it can get through any obstacles that you may face in Arboration. Maybe just don't put it against Microraptors, because that didn't go so well for me. But also, as you can see here, this is one of its abilities. It can hold smaller creatures in its mouth, and it will simply chomp on them until they are dead. It's essentially an upgraded bleed ability, and this is very useful if you have some little annoyances running after you and just generally annoying you. And I wouldn't put it at fault that it can easily kill alphas as well, just the alpha ran off the cliff in this case. But this thing has definitely easily been able to kill alphas for me in the past, and on Arboration it is a great creature for defeating Rockwell as well. This thing has reasonable speed and reasonable stamina, and on Arboration it is useful all the time. On other maps it is only useful in the night, as in the day this thing is as groggy as hell. So yes, overall this is mainly a travelling creature for Arboration, but it is still useful on other maps as well, just maybe not quite so much, as Arboration is underground, so it essentially works as nighttime all the time for these things, which is why these things are actually mainly used on Arboration, but I still think they deserve to get talked about, as they are very viable travel solutions before the Rock Drake. In at number 3 is the Thyla. Now this creature is definitely a lot more accessible and useful than what the Megalosaurus is. This thing has incredible speed and can tackle pretty much any landscape apart from water. Also, on top of all of that, these things have an incredible amount of damage, and these things will easily be able to kill anything in your path. And with its wealth of abilities, this thing is simply a great combat, but also in this case, travelling mount. Namely, this thing can climb up vertical walls and surfaces, which means if you see a cliff, you can simply run up it and it's no problem. With other creatures, this would be an insane inconvenience. But obviously for the Thyla, that simply isn't the case, and that's also why it is actually on this list. Also, in another ability in terms of combat, this thing has the absolutely fantastic bleed ability. So it means it will take, I think, 25% of a creature's health once the bleed ability has finalized, which means this thing can really tank through any creature, and that works no matter a creature's health. When you get into mods and creatures with millions of health, the bleed ability is literally a godsend, but I doubt many people are going to be playing GOX. Overall, the Thyla is a superb travel mount, and it definitely deserves to be on this list. It really does pack a punch, and it has a lot of speed and weight to get you around. In at number 2 is the RG. Now I'm sure many of you agree with this creature being on the list, and I would definitely agree with that too. This is one of the travelling kings, and I think this is far superior than the Quetzal ever was, because this thing isn't actually the speed of a literal snail. Now the Quetzal used to be the absolute beast of travelling back in the day, as you could level up its speed and that thing was insane. But the RG has simply overtaken it thanks to the flyer update, meaning that flyers can't now level up speed, unless you obviously enable flyer speed leveling in your single player settings or your server moderator supports it. But we're not back in those days of Ark, so we have to talk about Ark currently. And currently the RG is an absolute beast of travelling. It has a reasonable speed and it has a ton of weight and enough stamina so you don't have to take breaks every 5 seconds like the Pteranodon has to. Also, on top of that, if you did want to do some farming along with your travel, you can easily, as its saddle is a portable smithy, so if your metal weapons break, you can simply craft another one, and also it has weight reduction on things like metal, crystal, and obsidian. And finally, in at number 1 is the Griffin. Now, I personally think the Griffin is definitely the best travel mount in Ark. I was torn between the Wyvern and the Griffin, but the Griffin's dive bomb ability, which gives it insane speed, really just takes the cake for me. This thing is an absolutely insane travel mount. It is probably one of the fastest creatures on the Ark map. And yes, you could put a Snow Owl in the place of the Griffin, but the Griffin has a few abilities that the Snow Owl simply doesn't have, and this isn't an Ark healing creatures video. On the Griffin, you are able to wield weapons while riding, but sadly on the Snow Owl you can't, which is why I have put it above the Snow Owl on this list. In fact, the Snow Owl didn't even make it onto the list. But also, that dive bomb ability is very useful in so many different ways. It's not just an ability that gives you insane speed to travel across the map. It is also a great source of dealing damage and a great way to surprise the enemy in any kind of PvP situation. In this demonstration, I'm showing you me killing a Bronto, and in a moment I am going to dive bomb the hell out of it, and in about 30 seconds this thing is very easily dead, and you can use this ability on any creature you want. It is a lot easier on larger creatures though, as if you're trying to hit a dodo with this dive bomb ability from that height, you're going to need to have very good accuracy. But also, another great use of the Griffin is raiding Wyvern trenches, as these things have incredible speed, so you can quickly grab an egg and get out really quickly, which means on your travels, if you want to get a Wyvern, you can simply grab one and keep on going. But anyway, that is the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Did you agree with this list? If not, comment your top 5 below, and I will see you all later. Bye.